With President Trump's moves to freeze foreign aid, Caitlin, what's happened?
Yeah, Kate, what had happened in the Trump administration is they turned off money going to nonprofits and contractors on foreign aid, people that were working with the organization USAID, the agency that the Trump administration was trying to shut down. And what the Supreme Court, what Trump wanted to do is he wanted a green light from the Supreme Court to keep that money shut off. It's being litigated at the trial level courts far below the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court just said is, we're not going to do that.
Trump was looking for permission from the Supreme Court to keep that funding off limits, which was still being argued in lower courts. But the Supreme Court just made it clear they are not stepping in at this point. They want the lower court to sort it out instead. There was even a judge who set a deadline last week for the administration to pay up $2 billion by midnight.
Supreme Court's ruling is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed. The Democrats on the court are thrilled, but they will automatically vote no. They're an automatic no, just like in Congress. They're an automatic no. They're against anything that makes America strong, healthy, and great again. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation.
Now let us get to the part that really highlighted the gravity of this legal defeat for Trump. It was not just about the ruling itself. It was the way he reacted afterwards on live television. He went on air and lashed out at the justices, referring to them as Democrats in robes and calling the decision terrible and deeply flawed. He put it out there that the justices hurt the country badly and suggested they should be ashamed of themselves.
Supreme Court has just struck down President Trump's tariff authority, saying his claim of emergency authority to issue sweeping tariffs to America's trading partners was unlawful. We have been watching the Supreme Court to see what they would decide about this. They have struck down the tariffs. Now, what happens next in terms of obviously the price we're paying and what we have paid in tariffs? What happens next with that? We will see.
It is honestly hard to believe he said that out loud. A sitting president taking shots at Supreme Court justices, especially after a 6-3 ruling where even his own 3 appointees sided against him. For quite a while, he had been acting with unchecked authority in Washington. But this conservative Supreme Court stepped in to tell a sitting Republican president that he had gone too far. It is a bold move to check a president's overreach, especially when you look at it through the lens of credible outlets like Reuters, which really emphasize the drama of the situation. As we look at this ruling, it is documented that the justices decided with a 6-3 vote that Trump overstepped his bounds by using emergency powers to impose sweeping global tariffs. Chief Justice Roberts even wrote in the majority opinion that Trump's emergency powers crossed constitutional lines, something you do not see every day.
Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And we're also initiating several Section 301 and other investigations to protect our country from unfair trading practices of other countries and companies. Thank you for your attention to this matter, and I say quite simply, which I've said for a long time, make America great again.
Meanwhile, there is the situation where Trump has to back down from those emergency tariffs that were deemed invalid. On top of that, he is now floating this idea of a new 10% global tariff package. The markets were jittery with worries about foreign allies and an uncertain trade policy heading into the midterms. Various credible outlets, including Bloomberg, were on it. Honestly, it is a pretty alarming picture when you put all this together. It is like the ultimate judicial defeat for Trump, combined with a dramatic live presidential meltdown. The way all of this is documented really shows the seriousness of the situation. It is almost ironic that in the midst of this chaos, Trump decided to label the justices as Democrats in robes.
That the 2 dissenting judges, Clarence Thomas and Kavanaugh, along with Justice Alito, all dissented from that decision. So pretty fascinating stuff there. The Supreme Court striking down President Trump's tariff policy, something that is not only likely to get a very strong response, to say the least, from President Donald Trump, but also could have a major impact on the current world order. The president imposing sweeping tariffs on nations all across the country.
That comment stands out as one of the most revealing things he said throughout the whole saga. What is even more remarkable is that he used that phrase right after a ruling that included 3 of his own appointees. It is truly a self-defeating way to characterize a decision that had 2 justices he appointed joining the other 3 liberal justices in a 6-3 majority against him. The image of him calling them Democrats in robes just adds another layer of irony to the entire situation. It is a pretty stark confirmation that his usual partisan framing just does not hold up when countered by the reality of the majority opinion.
Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And we're also initiating several Section 301 and other investigations to protect our country from unfair trading practices of other countries and companies.
I want to break down this whole situation where the Supreme Court has really shaken things up for the president. It is fascinating, but honestly a bit alarming. So first off, the president announced new replacement tariffs just hours after taking a hit from the courts. This quick response really shows he is aware of the serious internal damage a ruling can cause, and he is trying to regain some political momentum. It is a clear signal that he is not taking the judicial defeat lightly and is quickly trying to fill the policy gap created by that ruling. Then there is the critical reaction to this whole scenario. The media has described the president's actions in a pretty harsh light, drawing comparisons to a monarch, pointing out how concerning this judicial check is for the balance of power, especially when it comes to the president's authority going into the next election cycle. This characterization is not just for show. It carries weight about institutional accountability at a time when this kind of scrutiny is really vital. And finally, we have the political fallout from the president openly criticizing Supreme Court justices on live television. This behavior raises questions about how the public perceives judicial independence and, even more importantly, the president's temperament. In the context of the upcoming 2026 elections, it is crucial for voters to consider these factors when evaluating leadership. There is a lot at play here, and it is definitely worth taking a good look at all these dimensions to understand the full impact of what is happening. So let us break down what just happened with the courts and Trump's executive power. It is quite remarkable to see how these legal decisions went from expanding his authority to finally drawing some lines. There's a lot to unpack here, especially the details about this unusual ruling. Reuters described this court decision as a rare public censure, indicating that Trump reached the limits of his power after acting with unchecked authority in Washington for an entire year. That is a pretty big deal. The way they worded it really emphasizes the seriousness of the situation. It is like a huge alarm bell in the realm of accountability. When you think about it, a whole year of functioning without significant checks, followed by the court stepping in and saying enough is enough, creates a striking contrast. It highlights the sudden shift from extended unchecked power to a much-needed constitutional correction, which is alarming to say the least. This characterization from Reuters is significant too. They have used some strong language to signal just how problematic this overreach has been. It really underscores the importance of judicial independence and accountability in our political system, making it one of the most significant aspects of this whole situation. Let us unpack what went down when Trump decided to address the Supreme Court justices on live television. He really went for it by calling them Democrats in robes and telling them they should be ashamed of themselves. This was a pretty big moment, especially considering the implications for how the public views presidential temperament and the independence of the judiciary, especially with the 2026 elections approaching. When a president reacts to a significant legal ruling by taking to live television and making such statements about Supreme Court justices, it sends some serious signals. This is exactly the kind of presidential temperament that independent voters keep an eye on, especially in those competitive electoral districts where every vote counts. You cannot help but notice that he chose to make his public outburst in front of a national audience rather than keeping it behind closed doors. That is what makes this particular moment so alarming. It goes right into the public record and gives a very clear view of his temperament. This kind of behavior, broadcast for everyone to see, raises serious questions about how a president handles pressure. It is honestly hard to believe he said that out loud. Telling justices they should be ashamed of themselves on national television just amplifies those concerns about presidential behavior during such a critical electoral period. Now, on top of that, there is the whole aspect of market reactions and how these outbursts could be affecting foreign alliances and trade policy, especially with the midterms looming. It is essential to understand what these documented market jitters mean for the economy and international relations, especially following the significant judicial losses he is facing. The concerns we are talking about are not just political. They ripple out into the economic and geopolitical arena, and each piece is intricately linked. There are some pretty interesting things happening since the ruling came down. It turns out that the judgment has sparked significant uncertainty in the economy, with serious ripple effects on diplomacy. Markets are reacting to the surprising removal of what everyone thought was a solid tariff policy, which has people on edge. Foreign allies are now shifting their views and reassessing what they thought they knew about America's trade strategies, especially with midterms on the horizon. This is really shaking up the core of the whole America First economic message that had been at the forefront. So, we have got this perfect storm brewing: nervous markets, anxious allies, and uncertain elections all coming together. Bloomberg's coverage really highlights this combination, showing just how impactful this judicial ruling is. It is honestly significant that courts that used to grant Trump more deference are now pulling back and drawing clear lines when he tries to exert maximum power over tariffs and unilateral decisions. This shift is critical to understanding where we stand judicially and why this tariff ruling is such a monumental moment in relation to Trump's approach moving forward. It is revealing that while some of Trump's powers are expanding, they also come with strict constitutional limits in other areas, a balancing act that does not give him a free pass. The earlier case, Trump versus the United States, specifically focused on this idea of immunity. The current climate definitely invites us to rethink how we have understood the court's role in all of this. The recent ruling has sparked quite an interesting discussion about the limits of power. It really emphasized how the toughest economic authority claims, like those concerning tariffs, can sometimes go beyond even the broadest interpretations of emergency laws. It benefits everyone when we set clear limits, and courts trying to draw those lines after such expansions helps us understand that support from the judicial system is more practical than absolute. There is a striking contrast between Trump's emotional statements on television and Chief Justice Roberts' emphasis on the rule of law in the published majority opinion. These two moments highlight a fundamental gap between individual emotional reaction and the formal constitutional accountability we expect from our institutions. The situation has certainly produced a significant public moment, and it is important to note that the public perception of these contrasting narratives is significant. It is a fascinating dynamic when you think about it, one individual expressing outrage and another insisting on legal requirements. This display captures the heart of our current political discourse and the accountability we demand. Watching it unfold on national broadcasts adds to its intensity, making these contrasting expressions very difficult to ignore. Let us break this down into 4 clear points so you can really grasp what is happening with this Supreme Court ruling. It is honestly hard to believe how significant all this is, and I want you to walk away with a solid understanding. Starting with the first point, Reuters called the Supreme Court's 6-3 tariff ruling a rare public censure, indicating that Trump has finally reached the limits of his power after acting with unchecked authority in Washington for a whole year. Al Jazeera's legal experts back this up by mentioning that this marks the first time this term that the court has directly tackled Trump's ongoing challenge to the rule of law. This all highlights a crucial moment in institutional accountability after a whole year of largely unchecked executive authority. The Supreme Court's correction makes this one of the most significant moments of institutional behavior we have seen, so it is pretty clear that this ruling is a significant international confirmation. Al Jazeera's observation about confronting the rule of law challenge is meaningful too, as it comes from respected legal evaluations of our institutional trajectory. Now on to the second point. Trump went on live television and referred to the justices as Democrats in robes, expressing that they should be ashamed of themselves. This outburst came after a ruling where even his own appointees, Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, sided against him. It really shows a disconnect from the reality of his own appointed justices. The self-defeating partisan framing is on full display, especially considering how this all unfolds in the public eye. It is becoming increasingly clear that this could have some serious consequences for the upcoming 2026 elections, where independent voters will be crucial. And then there is Trump, who did not waste any time. Within hours of the court turning down his sweeping emergency tariffs, he announced a new 10% global tariff as a replacement. This quick move sends a pretty obvious message about the damage he is facing and confirms that he knows he has to recover politically after such a big judicial loss. The BBC has documented this shift, showcasing just how significant this change is, especially with the pressure of political accountability looming over him. What we are witnessing here is all part of the fallout from that major Supreme Court decision. It is truly essential to keep an eye on how this story develops. All right, so let us break this down a bit further. Recently, the Supreme Court made a pretty big ruling, deciding 6-3 that Trump went too far with his emergency powers when he tried to put sweeping global tariffs in place. Chief Justice Roberts led the way with the majority opinion, pointing out that what Trump did crossed constitutional boundaries and just could not be allowed to continue. Reuters noted that this was a rare public censure, marking the moment Trump truly hit the limits of his power after behaving with unchecked authority in Washington for quite some time. Now, there are several things I am keeping an eye on to see where this all leads. First up, there is the 10% replacement tariff litigation. I will be watching to see if it brings up the same major questions and clear congressional authorization requirements as we have seen before. This will show whether the court ruling turns into significant ongoing checks on Trump's economic authority. Next, I am curious about Trump's ongoing attacks on the court. If he ramps up the rhetoric about Democrats in robes, that could reflect a growing threat to judicial independence, especially since he has such a loud platform to amplify his views. Then there is the midterm polling. I am interested to see if the combination of this judicial defeat and the public meltdown has any measurable impact on how voters view Trump's temperament and competence, especially in competitive districts. Finally, I will be paying close attention to how Republican Congress members respond. If they start acknowledging the constitutional correction the court delivered, it might lead to more Republican crossover support. This would be crucial for creating a bipartisan coalition for oversight and accountability as we head into 2026. So to sum it all up, the Supreme Court's decision really shakes things up and sets the stage for a lot of possible developments. Al Jazeera highlighted how this is the first time this term that the Supreme Court has really tackled Trump's broader challenge to the rule of law. It is a significant moment for our judicial system. In a rather surprising live television moment, Trump called the justices Democrats in robes, describing the ruling as terrible and deeply flawed. He went on to say that they hurt the country badly and suggested they should be ashamed of themselves. Talk about a dramatic moment broadcast for everyone to see. Then there is the BBC, which noted how Trump quickly announced a new 10% global tariff replacement just hours after being forced to roll back the invalidated emergency tariffs. Bloomberg also reported on the ripples this caused in the markets, with worries about uncertainty in trade policy leading up to the midterms. It seems like the fallout from this judicial defeat is creating quite the economic and geopolitical stir. Reuters mentioned how the ruling almost felt like a check on a monarchy. Al Jazeera reiterated the significance of this first confrontation with the rule of law. CBS New York was right there capturing the moment of Trump's live outburst. All of this paints a pretty alarming picture of a sitting president described as having acted with unchecked authority for an entire year, only for the conservative Supreme Court, with Trump's own picks in the majority, to finally say, enough is enough. This situation has produced one of the most dramatic moments of presidential accountability in modern American history. I am keen to track every twist and turn as this story unfolds and see where it leads us in terms of constitutional and electoral repercussions. I cannot help but think about how this whole situation plays out in the upcoming 2026 elections. It is interesting to see whether the attempt to frame everything as a witch hunt can flip what should be a significant judicial loss into a story of political martyrdom. It is a tricky dynamic, really. This narrative might actually end up energizing the very base that would typically be weakened by such a formal judicial correction.